Since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, Ukraine and Russia have been in a long-standing war. The rising wave of Russian-backed separatists in Donbass, the easternmost region closest to Russia, has intensified the conflict. The conflict has accelerated Ukraine's desire to join NATO, a military and political alliance specifically made in response to the Soviet Union's expansionist motives. Russia has repeatedly threatened Ukraine both economically and militarily, impeding Ukraine's ability to join NATO.
However, before February 24th, Russia invading Ukraine seemed to be far in the distance to most of the world, except for Ukrainians. They felt the growing tension as Russian troops grew around their borders. Even as early as February 16th, President Zelensky called for a day of unity in the face of a possible invasion. Then, not even 10 days later, Russia began its military invasion of Ukraine. This triggered the displacement of millions of Ukrainians. According to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, in just 5 weeks, a quarter of the population of Ukraine have been forced to flee their homes. As of April, more than 4 million refugees have fled Ukraine, making this the fastest growing refugee crisis since World War II. The top 3 countries that refugees have fled to are Poland, Romania, and the Republic of Moldova. Another 6.5 million people have been displaced internally within Ukraine. These displacements affect men, women, and gender minorities differently based upon their gender identities.
What do we mean by differently? Well, men, women, and gender minorities face different obstacles and experiences related to displacement due to the invasion of Ukraine. It is important for us to explore the ideas of masculinity and femininity, which inform the experiences of different gender identities. We have analyzed the invasion up until April 5th and laid out 3 important points that analyze different gendered experiences that come as a result of displacement in this video.
Both internally and externally displaced women in this conflict face unique hardships. Not only do they have to deal with the trauma of their ways of life crumbling around them, but they also are at increased risk for gender-based violence, or GBV. Gender-based violence can take the form of physical, sexual, verbal, emotional, and psychological abuse, threats, or coercion. A recent study found that displaced women are prone to heightened risk of gender-based violence compared to local women. Almost 8% of violent incidents against displaced women occurred at checkpoints or at reception centers for internally displaced persons, and 20% were perpetrated by armed men. Thankfully, the UN has taken notice of the fact that displaced women are at increased risk of gender-based violence and have set up a myriad of measures to combat GBV. There is a hotline that, according to the United Nations Population Fund, has received more than 2,300 calls and online requests between March 11th and April 3rd. There is also a cash and GBV task force to ensure that delivery of multi-purpose cash of $228 million under the flash bill is done safely and with consideration for women and girls' access and utilization. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the United Nations Population Fund have set up the protection from sexual exploitation and abuse and prevention of gender-based violence efforts in Hungary, Poland, and Moldova. They have also produced and disseminated PSCA and anti-trafficking information materials on both sides of the border and at reception and transit centers. It will be interesting to see reports of whether the UN's efforts at combating GBV for displaced Ukrainian women alleviate GBV.
Because this is an ongoing and recent event, there is no large-scale research done specifically for LGBT Ukrainian refugees fleeing the Russian invasion, and thus our research relies heavily on individual reports. When seeking refugee status, it can be difficult to prove one's LGBT identity due to fear of retaliation, as well as Ukraine's hesitancy to recognize homosexual relationships as valid. Hate crimes against LGBT Ukrainians are common, as is hate speech in the media. While homosexuality was legalized in 1991, there is no legislation protecting against discrimination based on the fear that it would damage moral principles. Law enforcement is the leading factor in persecution, with 61.5% of LGBT Ukrainians who reported abuse from law enforcement, including extortion, threats to reveal sexuality, and physical and sexual violence. The Washington Post reported in late February on a letter sent to the United Nations from the U.S. intelligence detailing fears of future human rights abuses on vulnerable Ukrainians, including LGBT individuals, following the Russian invasion, alleging that Russia is creating lists of Ukrainians to be killed or sent to camps following military occupation. LGBT Ukrainians report being targeted in the Donetsk region, most often being forcibly displaced by law enforcement. They report fears of being jailed or killed if they do not leave. Many also are threatened if they do not reveal other LGBT Ukrainians. These Ukrainians report more difficulty in the east. The UN Refugee Agency largely focuses on internal displacement, relocating LGBT Ukrainians to western areas. A good portion of countries accepting Ukrainian refugees have anti-LGBT legislation in effect. Due to the lack of intervention from official sources, many LGBT refugees are left to rely on the help and support of individual volunteers. In July of 2021, the EU sued Hungary and Poland over this issue. Transgender women especially are being prevented from leaving due to the ban on military-aged men from leaving the country. Many trans Ukrainians are resorting to getting rid of their documents entirely, which can cause trouble at checkpoints when documents are reported as lost, or bribing security, which can result in detention. Many LGBT Ukrainians are staying in Ukraine to fight. Many activists have reported that due to growing solidarity between Ukrainians against a common enemy, there seems to be growing support of Ukrainian LGBT individuals. President Zelensky has also been supportive of LGBT Ukrainians in the past.
Men in Ukraine face unique obstacles relating to displacement throughout the Russian invasion. While many people in Ukraine are forcibly displaced both internally and externally due to personal security reasons, men face a unique challenge. They lack agency in deciding to flee and seek refugee status elsewhere. Under martial law, Ukrainian men ages 18 to 60 are mandated to remain in the country. This mandate denies them the agency to leave the country to seek refuge in other places away from the ongoing violence in the state. Some argue that this mandate is a violation of human rights for men in Ukraine. According to the IHL database, Rule Number 3 dictates the definition of combatant is as follows. All members of the armed personnel forces of a party to the conflict are combatants, except medical and religious personnel. If all men are part of the military forces, then they are, under customary international law, labeled as combatants and are eligible to be attacked in war. In addition, the urgency with which these civilian troops are being trained and mobilized leaves men and civilian women trained inadequately and vulnerable to security issues. While there are many Ukrainian citizens, both men and women, that are willingly taking up arms in this conflict to protect their sovereign nation, there are many men who do not wish to stay and fight for a variety of reasons. There are, however, consequences that men who are reluctant or unwilling to fight face, including legal repercussions as well as shame from family members and communities. Many men who wish to leave for whatever reason are paying smugglers to allow them to cross state lines. This option, however, is only available to men who can afford it. Paternal status can also determine men's agency to leave. Under Ukrainian martial law, there are certain exceptions for men with children and their ability to flee the country, including single fathers or sole caregivers. Ukrainian masculinity dictates that men are providers, protectors, and success seekers for their families, and therefore are expected to be providers, protectors, and success seekers for their foreign nation. This in turn would inform why Ukrainian men are expected to stay and fight. This lack of agency for men in Ukraine and choosing to stay or flee poses unique challenges for other gendered groups as well. For example, as mentioned before, there have been reports that many transgender women seeking to flee and seek refugee status have been forced to stay if they are determined to be male by the border crossing guards or their formal documents do not reflect the gender change. Forced conscription of men in Ukraine has also perhaps unintended consequences for both men and women who stay and flee in terms of security and vulnerabilities that arise for women traveling unaccompanied by men. Overall, the taking away of men's agency in this scenario has giant effects for both men ages 18 to 60 and all people across the entirety of the gender spectrum.
The varying experiences for different gender groups in Ukraine is just a reflection of how current gender norms are pushed to the extreme during wartime. Our gender analysis highlights the critical effects that wartime has on individuals, their experiences, and the loss of agency for individuals controlled by the state. Although we focused on groups based on gender, we have more information about other demographics and their experiences during war on our website.